Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Happy Monday to you as we kick off this new week in Washington with our eyes specifically on what's happening in London. Another round of trade negotiations between the world's two largest economies, the U.S. and China, remembering that an agreement was struck in Geneva last month to lower tariffs for 90 days. But it was a little bit fuzzy as to what else was part of that agreement, specifically what China was committing to in unrestricting exports of critical minerals to the United States. President Trump got Xi Jinping on the phone last week to try to clear that up. And of course, they're working on hammering out those fine details as we speak. The principals right now at this hour, Joe, still gathered in London.
That was a perfect setup. And Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern is actually at the scene to carry the ball onto what happens next. Bloomberg's chief political correspondent outside that meeting. Anne-Marie, how's it going inside?
Well, they just arrived 5 hours ago, and they are still at the negotiating table. About half hour ago, we actually saw food delivery being brought in. So they plan, I think, on spending a few more hours here in London just past 6 p.m. So these talks are bleeding into the evening and potentially even till into tomorrow. What we do know from earlier, the NEC director, Kevin Hassett, talking about the fact, the contours potentially of this deal, easing some export controls that the United States has in place for semiconductors going to China. And then on the Chinese side, the U.S. wants to see more licenses when it comes to rare earths and magnets. They want to see an advanced pace that they thought they agreed upon in Geneva. The issue, of course, is what are the red lines for both of these economies? For China, it's clearly getting their hands on these advanced semiconductors, but how far is the United States willing to go? Say, are they willing to use potentially the H20 NVIDIA chips as a negotiating chip? And when it comes to China, how quickly are they really going to ramp up those rare earths? And I think what this shows you is that we are just 4 weeks out from when these two delegations met in Geneva. It just shows you how difficult trade negotiations are and reminds us all of how difficult it was for the purchasing agreement in Trump's first administration. That trade war started in 2018 and a deal wasn't in place until 2020.
Well, when we consider who is in the room today, Anne-Marie, obviously He Lifeng and Scott Bessent, Howard Lutnick are all there. Very high-level talks are taking place. But it was President Trump communicating directly with Xi Jinping by phone for the first time since assuming office for his second term that got our attention. Do we have any idea as to the extent to which this sets the stage for a face-to-face meeting between the two utmost leaders?
Well, that phone call definitely broke the ice. Member Secretary Bessent, after the Geneva talks a few weeks after, said that he felt like negotiations were stalling. There was a phone call, and that really led to the path to have this discussion today in London. On that phone call, though, the two leaders did discuss visiting each other. So President Xi Jinping invited President Trump and the First Lady to China, and then President Trump reciprocated as well. So potentially that could be a deliverable or something that at minimum is discussed at this meeting. Also, Kaylee, it's a great point to mention that Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is here. He was not there in Geneva. He's in addition to this meeting, and I think that just basically tells everyone that maybe we don't know how far the U.S. is willing to go, but easing of export controls is on the table.
Fascinating stuff, Anne-Marie. We have to be honest, though, we're still biting around the edges of a much larger potential deal here when it comes to tariffs. And I know we're looking at a deadline in August on that. Would it be a win for this to resolve to another greater meeting on tariffs, reciprocal tariffs against China?
Yeah, definitely, potentially. I think they would love to wrap this up before August, right? Because they're also dealing with a ton of other countries. The issue is, to your point, Joe, is that these are just two issues at the heart of a very bigger deal. When I spoke to the Treasury Secretary weeks ago, he had talked about how they don't want to decouple from China. There is a grand deal to be had. Of course, the issue is each country has red lines. And the other country is trying to get past those red lines. And the problem is, if you're in the United States and you care about national security concerns, there's a potential limit that you're willing to go and give to China. And then China is going to use what their leverage is, say in this instance, rare earths. So this goes beyond just trade. This has to do with national security issues as well. And to think that potentially they can get this done in August, I think is very optimistic, given the fact that what we saw just from a purchasing agreement of agricultural products by large took over a year during Trump's first administration.
All right, Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordorner, chief political correspondent, live in London on the scene for these talks. Thank you so much. And we want to get more context and analysis now as we turn to Nazak Nakaktar here on Bloomberg TV and radio. She's National Security Practice Group Lead at Wiley Ryan, also former Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis at the International Trade Administration. Nazak, welcome back to Balance of Power. As we consider what the U.S. may be willing to give here in these talks with China taking place today, a rolling back of export controls that have been concertedly part of an effort for the U.S. to restrain China's technological development. Where do you expect the line to be drawn? Are we really about to give them access to things that can help them develop the advanced semiconductors that we have been purposefully trying to make sure they cannot do successfully?
Yeah, Kaylee and Joe, great to be with you. Look, this is an incredibly complex issue, and it underscores a really important point. The fact that we have become so dependent on elements like critical minerals and the permanent magnets we need for our commercial sector, our defense sector, so much so that we actually have to give up a really important national security concerns, including dual use items. And I really want to stress the definition of dual use. Dual use items that China is seeking us to relax our export controls on are various types of AI chips, various types of chips in general, aerospace engine technology. And these are dual use because, of course, they have commercial applications, but they have enormous military applications, so much so that the government has decided to restrict them in the first place. So can you imagine this scenario where, because of our import vulnerabilities due to China's supply chains, we actually have to give up some of our critical national security concerns? The Trump administration is going to try to keep the wall up as much as they can and not give in to some of these China's demands. But the Chinese are going to double down. It's going to be tariff reduction, export control, relaxation, and then potentially something about Taiwan, as China has signaled in the past.
This is where I start to get a bit confused, Nazak. It's great to have you back. If this is in fact a national security concern, why is it on the bargaining table?
You know, that's really because we are dependent on some critical supply chains from China that are also impacting our national security concerns. Rare earths that you all were just talking about, permanent magnets. Again, these are things that China controls exclusively the supply chain. And in order, I think some folks in the administration believe, in order to get our defense sector up and running, the commercial sector up and running with these magnets that we need, we're going to have to give some things up. The other interesting aspect of this that makes it extraordinarily complicated is our import dependence is just goods from China. What China is seeking from us is actually the know-how and technology. That know-how and technology that I hope we don't give up to China, and we maintain our export controls, that's long lasting. Once you transfer technology to China, it's gone. You know, but China can always turn around and stop the exports of the things that we need, the magnets, the pharmaceuticals, to us at any time. And that's what I'm concerned about. Even if there's a handshake deal, even despite China's history of not adhering to deals, even if we get something, they can turn around tomorrow and block our access versus us having given up technology that now China can keep forever.
China, well, Nazak, one could listen to you and think that China is actually the one with all the leverage here. If they have a chokehold on this market that we need for our national security, if it's them that have the ability to just turn it on and off like a light switch, what hand does the U.S. really have?
You know, I think the U.S., if they really want to play it strongly, they can and not give up too much. And the pharmaceutical sector, one of the sector we have the know-how to make the drugs. I don't think we're as vulnerable as you know, some may think we are. And in terms of magnets, I mean, let's remember, we have huge magnet supply chain that's growing. We have light rare earths in California, heavy rare earths in Canada. A number of magnet producers have invested in the United States are growing. But let's also remember, we can reuse magnets. We can take magnets out of phones, out of autos, out of defense equipment, and just basically remagnetize them and reuse them. And the reason I say all that is because, sure, it takes time to scale what we're building, our own domestic supply chain, but we're not at a loss. We can reuse what we currently have. And that gives us so much leverage to stay strong, to not give in to China's demands, because we're not as dependent as the Chinese like to think that we are.
Sounds like a good time to short magnets, Nizak. I wonder to what extent Jensen Huang will help to influence the outcome of this question, specifically over export controls and semiconductors. He's got the president's ear. We know they have a relationship. He's been to the White House, and he talked a lot just a couple of weeks ago about how these building blocks for AI should in fact be based on American systems, even if it's AI companies in China that are doing the work, that the American building blocks should be in place. If that's the case, we're about to see a loosening of export controls for the better, correct?
Well, we're in a situation where so many of our companies are now just developing and have been for a number of years so much revenue from China that cutting off access to that market could be pretty much short-term, in their view, catastrophic for them. At the same time, again, they're asking the U.S. government to continue the exports of dual-use items that are aiding and abetting Chinese military. Even if we, the United States, built massive data centers in China, the Chinese are using those data centers for AI capabilities that augment their military. And the way China plays is, if you build it in China, you have to transfer technology to China. To me, it's a high-risk proposition that we're continuing to transfer all of our technology to China when China just doubles down, pours more money into it to indigenize it, and more people and resources. We saw what happened with DeepSeek. We saw what's happened over the last 15 years. China has accelerated its growth in technology from virtually being a really sort of developing country, not technologically advanced at all, to the technological powerhouse that it is today. And that is because we've been transferring our technology. And I think it's really time for the Trump administration to, one, take a second look as whether we want to give up more, and two, remember that we're not as dependent as some think we are.
Well, so Nazak, when we consider the time here for these very complex issues to be fully worked out, I don't know the extent to which you expect there to be firm, tangible outcomes of this meeting in Geneva, but knowing we are up against a deadline in August here of this 90-day window in which tariff levels have been brought down from the astronomical highs with which they were, is that enough time for the U.S. and China to really get into the nuances of all of this different policy, or are we just going to have to keep buying ourselves more and more extensions?
I think the likelihood that they're going to get out with, they're going to leave with a handshake deal is very likely. I think we're going to end up reducing some of our export controls, maybe on chips, chip technology, AI chip technology, the commercial aircraft engines that we've recently prohibited the exports to China. And you know what? China's basically going to say, fine, you can have more magnets. But China is probably not going to allow our military sector to have magnets for our defense and weapon systems. And, what good is a handshake deal when we have a country like China that's systematically broken deals? WTO commitments, its bilateral, cybersecurity deal in 2015, phase one deal, the Geneva deal. So yes, I think from China's perspective, it's going to give in. After a little bit of acting tough, it'll give in a little bit. It'll say, fine, I'm going to license these things to you. We're going to reduce our export controls. And I am confident that within a month, we're going to find ourselves in a very similar situation, not getting the things we need from China. And then it's going to be a really tough call for what the administration is going to do next.
Sounds like reciprocal tariffs are not going away anytime soon.
I think that they're going to stay. And look, they were having a real dire impact on the Chinese economy when they were in the high double digits and triple digits. And I think that if the Trump administration really wanted to bring China to its knees, it could have kept the tariffs on for slightly longer. Of course, that also adversely impacted American industries. I think we're going to be doing this song and dance for many, many months ahead until one of the countries capitulates.
Nazak, great to have you back. Nazak Nakaktar, National Security Practice Group Leader, Wiley Rain, LLP, former Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis at the International Trade Administration. Always a great conversation. Kaylee, we'll find out maybe by the end of the day if we get a readout from either of these teams on what happened. But Anne-Marie says they're bringing in takeout. This may not end anytime soon.
Yeah, that's never a good sign if you're looking for something to wrap up quickly when they bring the extra nourishment in. But we'll continue to keep you updated on what's happening in London and what's happening in Los Angeles. That's where we turn to next as we consider President Trump deploying the National Guard without the say-so of California's Governor Gavin Newsom.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We all started our day listening to the same conversation. When I heard Tom Keene was going to be interviewing Andrew Cuomo, I canceled my plans at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. Fascinating back and forth here in a conversation you would only hear on Bloomberg. And of course, took on a very different direction following the protests that we saw in L.A. Not just the protests over the weekend, but the clashes with police. President Trump's decision to send in the National Guard. The Secretary of Defense's threat to mobilize Marines from Camp Pendleton. Donald Trump, just on Truth Social a short time ago, it was a great decision, he says, to send the National Guard to California. If we had not done so, Los Angeles would have been completely obliterated. Now, knowing that Andrew Cuomo is running for mayor, he's, of course, got his own ideas about a Republican president sending National Guard troops to the streets of a major American city. Listen to Andrew Cuomo earlier on Bloomberg.
This gets into President Trump's strategy, I believe. And look, first of all, on the immigration issue, he was very clear in his campaign. He believes it's an issue that works for him. During the campaign, he said he was going to deport criminals, dangerous criminals. And everybody said, yes, support dangerous criminals, of course. Now we're deporting 7-year-olds and we're disrupting families. And by the way, we're deporting people who shouldn't be deported. So that's a change. But this issue works for the president politically. The president is also very good, and I worked with the president in the first Trump administration, worked with euphemism. We had a lot of controversy, but this is a different tempo for him. Wayne Gretzky, skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it was. The Democrats have to adjust. They are skating to where the puck was. This immigration issue, in some ways, is a distraction from what Trump is really doing with cities, which is cutting the budget in a way that is so dramatic that you could really cause major difficulties for urban areas.
Governor Cuomo, pro tip. When you're going to talk a hockey, you're in a mayoral race. You pick Jean Rattel or someone like that with the New York Rangers. You don't go with Gretzky. Andrew Cuomo with us here as we look at this mayoral race. Okay, Robert Kuttner, no friend of yours, writing in American Prospect. He says, did Cuomo peak too soon? You've got the tensions of the primary. If you take the primary, the tensions of a general election with different independent candidates, and that is the present mayor in the back pocket of the president of the United States. And if we get LA, as Paul mentions, here, can you imagine this? I mean, I'll let you pick the geography, Governor Cuomo, but the present mayor of New York, can he protect the citizens of this city, given the relationship with the president after what we've seen in LA?
Short answer, no. And let's remember how extraordinary these issues, what's happening in LA. This is the exact reverse of what normally happens. Normally, it's the local government that makes the decision on how to handle an emergency and calls on the federal government. So a mayor or a governor would call on the federal government and say, I need help, please send the National Guard, or please send in additional federal help. I don't believe there's been a time where the president has sent in federal troops. You'd have to go back to like the 60s and President Johnson and Wallace, right? That's how far you have to go back. So this is Trump being Trump. This is Trump on this issue of immigration. I'm muscled. It's law and order. These cities, these Democrats, they're filled with illegals, and I'm going to come in, and I'm going to come in hot and heavy. He started in L.A. It will happen in New York. It will happen. He knows the formula, right? It happened in New Jersey.
Is this formula to go after you? I mean, this is anticipated.
His formula is to create chaos in the cities, and he is the voice of law and order. And you know, cities, all those Democrats, that's where all those illegal immigrants are, and he's going to come in and he's going to clean up. The flip side is, okay, create chaos in LA, create chaos in New York, create chaos in Chicago. Pretty soon, you create chaos in the nation, and that's bad for the economy.
Andrew Cuomo in a fascinating back and forth with Tom Keene here on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, adding the voice of Ashley Davis, Republican strategist, partner at S3 Group, former special assistant to the Director of Homeland Security. Ashley, it's great to see you. We just heard this whole conversation with Andrew Cuomo. You saw the back and forth. You heard me read President Trump's tweet earlier today. He says if we had not done so, calling up the National Guard, Los Angeles would have been completely obliterated. We can talk about the directive and what law this falls under and how we're defining insurrection. Politically speaking, good move?
Yeah, I actually am not sure that interview that Cuomo did this morning is going to be helpful for him. I just want to take a step back.
For
Cuomo,
yeah.
No, because, I mean, listen, a lot of people, whether you live in New York or not, are very unhappy with how New York has been as a city, especially post-COVID in regards to some of the crime. And he's running on a law and order platform, so you would think that this is something maybe from a states' rights perspective he can't be for, but I'm assuming he would want to make sure that New York does not turn into what's happening in LA. But yeah, to answer your question, absolutely this is a good political issue for the president. I don't think he cares one bit that if you see destruction happening in LA and the Mayor Bass and the governor are not doing enough to stop the destruction, especially when they're burning buildings, they're burning cars, his biggest issue is the fact that they're covering their faces and not having any ability to see who they are. Again, are these really protests from LA, or are they brought in like they have been in other places? But this is a winning issue for him. I would love to see polling on this in a week, because I would think most of the country would say why. The 40 people, and it's a very important fact, the 40 people that were arrested that sparked these protests this weekend, there was a layout this morning of the crimes that each one did. I mean, they're bad crimes. They're either murder, rape, significant burglary. I mean, it's not like that the people are protesting for, as Cuomo said, children and people that are, on their way to citizenship. Yeah. So this is something that's going to be very tough for Democrats to come over. And in my opinion, they're taking the bait over and over and over again. I mean, this is something that we've been talking about.
Seems Gavin
it's like
Newsom
an 80% issue that people support us cracking down on stuff like this.
Yeah, Newsom was telling people not that this was performative. Don't play into the hands of the administration. I'm wondering what you thought of Newsom pushing back on this. This played out on television in a pretty remarkable way, with Tom Homan threatening to arrest the governor and the mayor of L.A. Let's hear the response from Gavin Newsom on MSNBC.
He's a tough guy. Why doesn't he do that? He knows where to find me. But you know what? Let your hands off 4-year-old girls that are trying to get educated. Let your hands off these poor people. They're just trying to live their lives, man. Trying to live their lives, paying their taxes, been here 10 years. The fear, the horror, the hell is this guy? Come after me, arrest me. Let's just get it over with.
This is wild stuff.
It's
good politics for him,
almost as good as I was just going to say, it's actually making Newsom relevant again. I mean, that was kind of, if he truly does want to run for president. But again, maybe times will change in 3.5 years when we have another president. But I mean, this does not show tough on crime, which was such a big issue this time around.
Okay.
I mean, again, we know the president may go President Trump may go too far and the pendulum swings. So who knows?
Right.
We'll
Was
see.
arresting the governor going too far?
Well, I don't think it's going to happen.
You know, but that would maybe qualify as too far.
Yeah, I mean, this fighting on TV stuff, like whether or
Ask
over,
Elon.
or over social media is just a new norm.
This is quite a moment
And
our society is in here, isn't it? Well, so let's talk about the actual fine print, because you used to do this for a living. The directive signed by the president cites 10 U.S.C. 12406, referring to a provision in Title 10 of the U.S. Code on Armed Services. If there's a rebellion or danger of a rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States, it allows the federal deployment of National Guard forces.
Yeah, I don't think this is...
Are we calling this a rebellion?
What else would you call it?
A protest?
But the protest isn't just it's not a peaceful protest.
No.
It's a destructive protest. I mean, you saw the stuff. I mean, you
sure.
saw what was happening. I don't think it's like people holding signs.
Well, it kind of started that way in some cases, and I'm not here to weigh in on that one way or the other, but when you start thinking about an insurrection, we don't want to call January 6th that, but we're calling this an insurrection to qualify for the deployment of troops.
We may agree to disagree on this issue because no, I just think that there was enough destruction going on. I mean, listen, everything else is in the courts. Obviously the governor did sue the president for doing this.
Yes.
You know, I just have one thing to say. Katrina wouldn't have been as bad as Katrina was if the local government then would have allowed the President Bush to call in the National Guard, and he did not overturn the mayor at the time of New Orleans, and that was when right after the levees broke and whatever, and that was one of the biggest destructions in our country. I mean, I think that this is a very fine line, but again, legally we'll see. I'm sure it will be in the courts, but politically, president's bring it on. He's going to be in the courts for the next 10 years till anyway.
Well, I guess that's for sure. As a Homeland Security specialist, do you worry about the idea of Marines being deployed? And I realize that that's likely just a threat from Pete Hegseth, but would that be a line to cross?
I think that's a tougher line for sure. I mean, the Marines, and you have guns, and you'll have obviously troops, and it's a whole different scene. I think unless people are getting killed, if you see major destruction in regards to buildings burning, I mean, more than is already happening, I just can't imagine that happens, but we'll see. So, one thing that we were talking about before the air is, does this spread through city to city to city, like some of the things that happened during COVID? You know, obviously George Floyd, I mean, we can go down some of the issues, but that's what you don't want to see happen.
Well, that's my question.
But is this
a
call to, is this going to be a Democrats' call to action? Are they going to fall on the hill on this issue and call for protest? I'm not sure if you don't have kind of what's been happening with a lot of these protests, not necessarily immigration, but a lot of these professional protests that have been happening with destruction over the last 5 to so years, is you have people that are hired to come destroy things just to make chaos in the country, whether you believe it's Russia or China or whatever.
Yeah.
So but I would think anyone running for president is not going to want this they're not going to fall on their swords on this.
Well, this is what I wanted to get to you with as someone who's actually been in the building. You're looking at the great unknown of this summer inside, we'll say, the Department of Homeland Security. How do you start modeling for the possibilities? Because this could, in fact, go into other cities. What if this did go into New York, as Tom Keene was discussing with Andrew Cuomo? What if there's another Occupy movement? Is that what Homeland is working on now?
I'm sure they are. I think you have, and also you have a lot of events coming up, whether it's, a year from now is America 250, but we have the parade this weekend.
Right.
You have a lot of different opportunities for chaos, but also what the department is doing right now, along with the DOJ, is really concentrating on some of the destruction in regards to anti-Semitism. So you have the anti-Semitism, you have the anti-immigrant movement, and then you have the flames being flared, that if you're in the coordinating of state and local law enforcement right now within the Homeland Security Department, you are making sure that everyone's prepared for something to happen. Especially in the major cities.
Did you see the footage of this Australian reporter who was on the streets in Los Angeles, and she's talking about the response from the police? It was right around the time they started shooting rubber pellets or the bean bags and so forth, and deploying the tear gas. I don't know if we have this for our audience on YouTube, but she's actually live in Australia. This is the video from this situation, and she's shot in the leg while she's out there. This is the type of thing that can really change the way a story plays in the media. There you see her being shot, and we don't hear her screams right now if you're with us on the radio, but it was a bit of a scary moment for her. These things can turn pretty quickly in public opinion the way this is handled by authorities on the ground.
If you see peaceful protesters being strong-armed by the military, whether it's especially like the National Guard, yes, this can definitely change the conversation quickly. Obviously, that's super unfortunate. I hadn't seen that.
Yeah.
But by the way, there's going to be propaganda on both sides. You're going to see the same video of the guy with the Mexican flag and the
taking selfies,
burning burning the car and the mask.
Something particularly dystopian, by the way, about protesters burning robotic vehicles. I think we have truly reached a science fiction phase when we see stuff like that. But the aftermath here could be interesting. What happens in the next couple of days in Los Angeles? How do you cool the temperature?
Well, hopefully, I'm from what we're seeing today, there's not as many protests. There is less and less. I mean, it would be great if they stop, and then everyone kind of backs off. It's just what's scary and what's making me a little nervous, and going back to your Department of Homeland Security, making them a little nervous and local law enforcement, is if this does escalate.
Yeah. Could New York handle a situation like that better than L.A.?
Well, I think the current mayor of New York would handle it pretty well. And that is not a political statement one way or the other, but I think he saw, it's an election year. Obviously, there's
former cop.
Yes, but I think that he would probably call in the help. You saw that city was destroyed. It's starting to make its way back. Same with L.A. There has to be a grasp on some of this, not because of the protests. I'm just saying in general what's happened.
Well, I appreciate your point of view. We went into overtime because I really wanted to hear what you had to say about this. This is a very delicate moment, and we're lucky to have Ashley Davis bring out one side of this argument for us. From S3 Group, great to have you, and thank you.
Thanks. Nice
Ashley,
seeing you.
as always.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We reach for the next answer when it comes to reconciliation. The questions have not changed in a while. We're waiting for the Senate to show up with its version of President Trump's big tax and spend bill. Are we done calling it a big, beautiful bill? The big tax and spend bill. The question about tax breaks, will they be permanent? Business tax breaks, not just individual Trump tax cuts, but also, of course, Medicaid. I'll say changes for the benefit of this conversation. And then, well, if you're watching or listening to Bloomberg, the granddaddy of them all being SALT. I mention this because the Senate Finance Committee is going to put forth its part of the bill, the big, beautiful bill, this week. Mike Crapo, Republican, Wyoming, the chair, is behind the drive to make these tax breaks permanent. That's going to change the whole dynamic now because we're hearing that SALT is going to come down. We're hearing that Medicaid changes could happen, maybe the provider tax with worries about the impact on rural communities. And that could be enough to sink this bill when it goes back to the House. It's about to happen. Senator Crapo is going to put forth his bill this week. And you better believe that the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, is holding his breath right now. Let's assemble our panel for their take on this and a lot more. Jeannie Shanzano is with us, our Bloomberg Politics contributor and Democratic analyst with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and Lisa Camuso-Miller, Republican strategist, former RNC comms director, spent time working for a former Republican speaker. And Lisa, I'll start with you here. Are the shields up in the speaker's office right now? They know something's going to come back they don't want.
I think it would have to be, right? Joe, I think more than anything, they have expectations. They've had a little bit of time to think about how they're going to respond to this. I think that they've known where the fault lines are. So the Speaker's office is already working behind the scenes to figure out what kinds of expectations they might have, what kinds of adjustments they could make to get themselves to a place where they could all get it done. It's going to be a challenge. There's no doubt about it. But I think Speaker Johnson knew that going in, and he's got the people around him that are going to help him get a compromise bill that's going to be able to get done and get signed, because they are really motivated to get this right.
We heard from Mike Lawler over the weekend, Jeannie, the Republican from your state of New York, says you hack up that SALT deal, I'm a hard no. And that goes for others in the New York delegation. That alone would sink the bill, right? We can only lose 3, I believe, is where we're at. What happens when the bill comes back to the House then?
Yeah, hands off SALT. It's become sort of a mantra around these parts and in other high tax places. And, Mike Lawler is speaking for enough Republicans in the House from these high tax states that it's going to be very hard to get their vote if they reduce the cap from what they agreed to in the House. The problem, of course, for the Senate is that they don't have people in the Senate GOP who are really focused on SALT or care that much about it, number one. And number two, they are really intent on doing some damage to SALT. And the White House, by the way, has said the president is okay with that. I mean, President Trump has been all over the place on SALT. And so if they do touch SALT, which I think they will, they're going to have to be very cautious because they will lose the support in the Senate. The House rather. That said, I think we're hearing that Mike Lawler is going to talk to Thune. He's going to talk to other senators and tell them how damaging this would be, and they will come to some kind of compromise, I think, on the issue of SALT.
How much communication, Lisa, is going on behind the scenes right now between Mike Johnson and John Thune, maybe among their teams, knowing, if we know about this, they sure do, to try to limit the number of changes, to ask for some grace when it comes to the bill coming back? Or am I crazy? The Senate always jams the House.
No, I don't think you're crazy at all, Joe. I think if anything, you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't think the principals are meeting. I don't think that the two, two leaders will be meeting until we're getting closer to the end on this negotiation.
Mm-hmm.
But staff all day long are working together, not only at the highest levels, but all the way down into the committees to make sure that they're trying to find a way to get this right. And look, this is the way the House and the Senate do their business together. Do we knock on one another and say that they do work differently than we do? Yeah, absolutely. But the truth of it is that policy folks are working together to try to find common ground in order to get something that can get done and can get to the president's desk. And I do think that they're still really working towards a July 4th completion project.
Boy, that would be something. Chuck Schumer doesn't necessarily see it that way. And before we get to that, we're going to have to deal with rescissions, Jeannie. This is something that Democrats were at one time worried about, and I'm wondering if you are at this point, because there's not a lot there. And we've got $9 billion, $9.4 billion in the rescissions package. Remember, this is public broadcasting, USAID, a couple of other things, including PEPFAR. And now this is something that brings us back to the George W. Bush administration funding to help fight AIDS and HIV on a global level. There are a number of Republicans who are uncomfortable with cuts to PEPFAR, and now at least 10 moderate R's, Jeannie, are privately saying in the House of Representatives that they're a no. Is it possible that this thing goes down and not a dollar is rescinded?
I think it is possible. At least the PEPFAR portion will go down, and rightly it should. The damage done to people around the world from the perspective of their health, if indeed they do move forward on that, is so astonishing. It's hard to wrap your head around that being the thing that they cut or tried to pull back. So I do think that goes down. I don't think they will, fail to get even a dollar, but I think it's going to be much, much smaller, because the reality of this entire big, beautiful bill and the rescission package itself is it is damaging to the people who need the support most. And that is what makes it, for so many of us, such a deplorable bill. It is hurting the people who need health care. It is hurting the people who need medical care. It is hurting the environment, which we all depend on. I mean, you can go down the litany, all in the interest of giving tax breaks to big business and people who make a lot of money. So this is where they are, and it is devastating from so many perspectives. And that is just one example from the rescission portion. Yeah. And I would just say that is why Donald Trump is so intent on pushing out pictures of what's going down in LA, because he very much doesn't want to talk about that, but he wants to talk about the fact this invests money in the border, where he wants to make the case it is needed.
Remember when Mitt Romney was going to cut Big Bird's funding, Lisa? turned out to be not the best time spent, considering the return you get on the dollar, to make that argument. Are we really doing this? We're going to defund PBS once and for all here.
I mean, it feels like that's where we're headed for sure. And I think Jeannie's point is one to take. I also think that we need to consider that when you are asking so many vulnerable members of Congress on the right and the left, for that matter, to make these hard decisions in the reconciliation legislation, when it comes to rescissions, I think a lot of political capital has been expended already. And that's the other difficulty here, is that had we had this bill go through with pieces of good policy, I think that a lot of other folks would feel better about taking a sharper pencil to the budget and these opportunities that are coming through in the rescissions package. The problem is, I think people are going to be just downright tired and unhappy with the way these processes are moving. And so that alone makes it that much more difficult for them to get to a place where they can agree upon whether or not PBS should be part of the chopping block, PEPFAR should be part of the all of these things are just one blow after another that they know they're going to have to answer for when they go home in August, and when they have to compete for their seats up again in the midterms, which are just around the corner.
It is really interesting when lawmakers rediscover certain constituencies depending on the debate. Here, Jeannie, you back off and look at what happened with the Doge, or I guess is happening. They continue their work in the wake of Elon Musk. But that's what brought us here. This was supposed to be codifying the work of the Doge, not $2 trillion, but $9.4 billion. You look at the big, beautiful bill, which was supposed to lower debt and deficits, and there are still a number of folks in Washington who will say, in the administration, Republicans on Capitol Hill will say that it does, when you factor in certain levels of growth and returns from tariffs. But the Congressional Budget Office, every major economist, all of the think tanks here in Washington say that it'll add trillions to the debt and deficit. This cost-cutting thing, Jeannie, turns out to be kind of difficult, huh?
Yeah, it certainly does. And you can take any one of those areas you just mentioned, and we can talk about the impact on particular constituencies of these representatives and senators. But let's also look at the impact of the most vulnerable in our communities as it pertains to public health. This intent to cut and gut Medicaid and Medicare will be devastating in rural hospitals. It'll be devastating for large populations of elderly, young people. And then let's jump over to look at something we all should have an interest in, and that is something involving our environment, clean energy. We're looking at COP30 in November in Brazil, and we are going to apparently send a contingent to that, maybe go down there. If they pass this bill, they will have destroyed things that were intent on giving green energy tax credits and other avenues by which we could move to clean green energy and allow all of us to live longer and in a better and healthier state around the world. So the impacts of this thing are devastating from many perspectives. And yet you see, even Tom Massey says it's likely going to get through in some shape or another. And so it is something that, you know, you just watch it go on and you realize the devastation that is embedded in a bill this big in the interest of saving money for wealthy and big business. And that is I think, a tremendous disservice to the entire community.
Well, I know you've been through a few of these rounds, Lisa, when it comes to big promises in cutting spending, but it is likely that this bill is going to pass, at least in its current form, when it comes to tax and spend levels, minus some adjustments around the edges. The missing component is revenue from tariffs, according to a lot of Republican lawmakers who we talk to. And right now, the Trump team is in talks with China to try to craft a trade deal. How do these all reconcile, and will tariffs actually help to make the difference?
Oh, I mean, I think that that's the hope out of the White House. I think their expectation is that it will definitely make the difference. The other thing, too, is that, you know, when Jeannie talks about the fact that we have all these other things that are in the bill that are going to cause concern, if you walk outside of this beltway and you ask people out in the districts what they care about, they want change. And they're not really sure what it takes to make change, but they're willing to take a chance that these new unconventional ways are the ways to make change. And so they're not willing to take opportunities as it relates to climate change and other risky kinds of ideas that they think about until, in fact, their basic needs are met. And so if costs can come down, if tariffs are going to make that difference, I'm not really sure they care about how the sausage is made, Joe, provided that the change happens and happens in a way that helps them and helps their bottom line. So while we all existentially know that all of these other things that Jeannie mentioned are part of the bill and are problematic, people want basic needs met.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.